It was a quiet Sunday morning in Brentwood, California. The kind of morning where everything seems perfect, the sun casting golden light over manicured lawns, birds chirping in the trees, and a sense of peace hanging in the air. But inside one $13.5 million mansion, that peace had been shattered beyond repair. What no one could have imagined was hiding behind the walls of the Reiner family home, a secret so horrifying it would leave the entire country in shock. How could a family that appeared so wealthy, so sophisticated, and so normal be harboring such darkness? And how did it go unnoticed, even by the people who lived there? These were the questions that would dominate headlines for weeks, yet the answers were more horrifying than anyone could anticipate. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were the kind of couple people looked up to. Elegant, refined, known for their philanthropy and social presence, they seemed to have everything. Neighbors described them as the quintessential power couple, living a life many could only dream of. And yet, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the polished exterior lay secrets, tensions, and a darkness that would ultimately culminate in tragedy. On that fateful Sunday, tragedy struck with a finality that stunned everyone who knew the family. It was their daughter Romy, only 27, who discovered the unimaginable. She entered the home with an unease she couldn't shake, an instinct that something was terribly wrong. And she was right. Her parents, Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found brutally stabbed to death, their lives extinguished in a scene that no amount of wealth or status could protect them from. But the murders themselves, as horrifying as they were only the beginning of a much larger, darker story. What Romy revealed next would shake the foundations of her family and leave law enforcement and the entire nation reeling. Just hours after the bodies were found, police were alerted to a disturbing detail. Romy had spoken of a dangerous family member who needed to be considered a suspect. That suspicion quickly fell on Nick Reiner, the couple's 32-year-old son, who lived in the guest house on the estate. But while the authorities worked to piece together what had happened, no one could have predicted the secret lurking just behind Rob Reiner's bedroom wall. A secret that, when uncovered, would make headlines and ignite a national conversation about trust, wealth, and the hidden horrors that can exist even in the most seemingly perfect homes. What investigators found behind that wall was shocking in every sense of the word. A 12-year-old girl, chained and hidden from the world, had been trapped in a space no bigger than a closet. How could this have happened? How could a child go unnoticed in such a large, luxurious estate? And why had no one outside the family been aware? These questions were only the beginning, each more disturbing than the last. The image of a child confined, terrified, and forgotten by the world was a stark contrast to the gleaming facade of wealth and comfort that the Reiners projected. It was the kind of revelation that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about appearances, privilege, and the dark corners of human behavior. Imagine, for a moment, walking through the grand hallways of a mansion worth millions of dollars. You would expect beauty, art, laughter, the signs of a life well lived. Instead, in this house, there were whispers of fear, hidden corners filled with secrecy, and, ultimately, an atrocity that would change the Reiner family forever. The contrast between perception and reality in this story is almost too much to grasp. On the one hand, a family celebrated and admired. On the other, a horror that defies imagination. Even as the story began to unfold in the media, investigators were piecing together the timeline of events that led to that tragic Sunday morning. Rob and Michelle had lived their final hours completely unaware of the danger that would soon befall them. Nick, the primary suspect, had a history that law enforcement would later scrutinize intensely: relationships, patterns of behavior, and motives that would begin to make sense only in the context of what was ultimately uncovered. Romy's courage in coming forward, her decision to alert police about a potentially dangerous family member, became the pivot point that allowed authorities to intervene and, eventually, discover the girl hidden behind the wall. Without her, who knows how much longer the child might have remained trapped in that hidden, horrifying space? And yet, even as authorities began their investigation, the public's curiosity grew. Social media was ablaze with speculation, theories, and disbelief. How could a family known for its prominence and wealth harbor such secrets? What does it say about appearances, trust, and the assumptions we make about people based on their status or the image they project? And most importantly, how did the child survive? And what was her story? These questions were not just headline fodder. They were a reflection of the shock and disbelief felt by millions who could not reconcile the horror of what had been hidden with the seemingly normal lives the Reiners led. Behind every wall in that mansion, it seemed, there was a story untold. Rooms that had been meticulously decorated, filled with memories, laughter, and family life, also held the potential for concealment and terror. The very structure of the house, designed to evoke luxury and comfort, had been manipulated into a trap. And when investigators finally breached that wall, the reality of the situation became undeniable. A 12-year-old girl, confined and vulnerable, had been living in the shadow of death, her life unfolding in a space invisible to the outside world. What makes this story even more shocking is the scale of denial and deception. How could such a secret exist in plain sight? What enabled a child to be hidden in a multi-million-dollar estate without detection? And what does it say about the people around her, the family, the staff, the neighbors, who, knowingly or unknowingly, were part of an environment where horror could flourish behind closed doors? These are the questions that haunt the narrative, keeping the audience not just engaged but desperate to understand the sequence of events, the motives, and the hidden dynamics that led to this unimaginable moment. This is not just a story about wealth, status, or tragedy. It is a story about the extremes of human behavior, the limits of perception, and the hidden corners of a seemingly perfect life. Every detail, every testimony, every piece of evidence collected by law enforcement paints a picture of a family and a household that was far more complicated and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. And as this story unfolds, you will see how appearances can be deceiving, how courage and vigilance can save lives, and how a single revelation behind a bedroom wall can ripple across an entire nation. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It's easy to look at someone's life from the outside and assume you know their story. From glossy magazine spreads, carefully curated social media posts, and neighborhood chatter, Rob and Michelle Reiner seemed like the epitome of a perfect life. Their Brentwood estate was a masterpiece of architecture and luxury, complete with manicured gardens, sparkling pools, and rooms that seemed lifted from the pages of design magazines. Friends described them as generous, polished, and impeccably poised. To the world, they were untouchable. They had wealth, influence, and the kind of family life many would envy. But perfection, as anyone who studies human behavior knows, is often a mask. Behind the grand entrances, the laughter at charity galas, and the meticulously framed family photos, there were fractures invisible to most outsiders. The Reiners were no exception. For those closest to them, there were subtle signs. A tension that lingered in casual conversation, a look of frustration behind Rob's practiced smile, a quiet unease in Michelle's demeanor when certain topics arose. These weren't dramatic gestures or shocking confrontations. They were tiny, almost imperceptible cracks. And over the years, those cracks would widen into fault lines capable of catastrophic collapse. Neighbors often remarked on the family's seeming normalcy. Romy, their daughter, was frequently seen walking the dog in the early mornings, headphones in, a smile on her face. Nick, the son, had a quieter presence, less socially polished but seemingly untroubled, often disappearing into his own world in the guest house tucked away from the main estate. Outwardly, it was the image of a loving, affluent family. Yet, even the neighbors who claimed to know the family were not aware of the silent undercurrents of tension, fear, and secrecy. One of the most curious things about families like the Reiners is the way wealth amplifies both image and illusion. It becomes possible to hide everything behind polished surfaces, designer interiors, meticulously maintained lawns, the kind of lifestyle that convinces outsiders everything is fine. But wealth also creates isolation. When a family has the means to separate themselves from the community, to insulate their private lives from scrutiny, the risk of hidden darkness grows. In the Reiners' case, their luxurious lifestyle may have masked, or even enabled, the horrors that were unfolding behind closed doors. Friends who spoke to the media after the tragedy painted a portrait that seemed incompatible with the events that followed. They were wonderful people, one friend said. Always so kind, always so present for the community. You would never suspect anything like this. Yet law enforcement and investigators would later reveal that beneath that veneer of perfection were layers of dysfunction. Arguments had been escalating quietly for years. Warnings had been ignored. And while no one could have predicted the murders themselves, the hidden dynamics within the household set the stage for the unimaginable discovery that would shock the nation. Romy, now thrust into the center of this nightmare, had spent her entire life observing her parents, interpreting their moods, and navigating the subtle complexities of a high-profile family. She had been the attentive daughter, always mindful of appearances, aware that in a family like hers, a misstep could attract scrutiny or judgment. But no level of attentiveness could have prepared her for what awaited her that Sunday morning. The scene of her parents' deaths and the revelation that her brother, Nick, was immediately a prime suspect. For Romy, the world she thought she understood had collapsed. The house that had been a sanctuary was now a crime scene. Every room she had known intimately was suddenly filled with suspicion, grief, and fear. And in the midst of this chaos, she carried a burden that would define the story to come. She had seen the warning signs of a dangerous family dynamic before anyone else had. Her voice would be the one that brought investigators to the hidden truth, a truth that would be concealed behind walls and silence until that fateful morning. It's worth noting here the strange duality of human perception. To the outside world, the Reiners were perfect. Inside the walls of their estate, however, lives were lived in fear and secrecy. How often do we, as observers, mistake outward appearances for reality? How often do we assume that wealth, status, and social polish are synonymous with happiness and safety? The tragedy of the Reiners forces a hard confrontation with these assumptions. And it also sets up one of the most shocking aspects of this story, the discovery of the girl hidden behind a wall, a secret no one in the outside world could have imagined. As investigators began to unravel the events of that fateful Sunday, they had to piece together not only the timeline of the murders, but also the hidden relationships and tensions within the family. Nick Reiner, the son, became the focus of intense scrutiny. Investigators dug into his past, his habits, his relationships, and his interactions with both parents. Each detail, each memory, and each interview added layers of complexity to a story that was already horrifying. And while Romy's revelation about a dangerous family member provided a crucial lead, it also opened a Pandora's box of questions. What could have driven a son to commit such a violent act? What role did the hidden family secrets play in the events that unfolded? The media quickly latched onto the narrative of wealth, fame, and tragedy. Headlines screamed about the brutality of the murders, the arrest of the son, and the unimaginable horror hidden within a mansion that should have been a safe haven. But even as the public consumed the story, they were unaware of the details that would emerge in the coming days, the ones that would push this tragedy from shocking to absolutely horrifying. Behind Rob Reiner's bedroom wall lay not just a secret, but a revelation that would redefine the meaning of fear, captivity, and betrayal within the confines of a family home. It is in this context, the contrast between image and reality, between perception and the hidden truths, that the first chapter of the Reiner tragedy truly begins. We are confronted with the uncomfortable truth that even in the most perfect of families, the potential for darkness exists. And as the investigation would reveal, the house itself, with all its grandeur and luxury, was both a stage for public admiration and a trap for private horrors. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances would later describe the family as normal or privileged but kind, words that suddenly felt hollow in the light of the atrocities discovered. The dissonance between who the Reiners appeared to be and what had transpired behind closed doors became a focal point of national fascination. It is this dissonance, the collision of perception and reality, that drives the tension in this story and makes the revelations that follow all the more shocking. And yet, even with all this context, the most terrifying element had yet to be uncovered. The discovery of the 12-year-old girl behind Rob Reiner's bedroom wall was not merely a shocking plot twist. It was the ultimate exposure of the cracks, the fractures, and the hidden darkness that had long existed beneath the polished surface. It was the culmination of tensions, secrets, and dangers that had been festering in silence. The Reiners' perfect image, then, was not just a facade. It was a carefully constructed illusion, maintained at the cost of human safety and dignity. It's a reminder that even the most seemingly perfect lives can conceal unimaginable horrors. And as the story moves forward, the question remains, how did such a secret remain hidden for so long? And what consequences would it have for the family, the investigators, and the nation at large? The answers, as we will see, are more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. But before the full scale of this tragedy is revealed, we must first understand the house, the family, and the subtle dynamics that allowed darkness to thrive unnoticed. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Sunday mornings are usually calm, even in bustling cities like Los Angeles. The sun rises slowly, painting the streets and hillsides with gold. The birds sing their songs, and the city seems to hold its breath before the day begins. But for the Reiner family on that particular morning, the serenity of the day was shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. A quiet morning became the scene of unspeakable violence, and a household that once exuded comfort and security was instantly transformed into a crime scene that would grip the nation in shock and disbelief. Romy Reiner, the daughter, was the first to realize that something was horribly wrong. Her initial instinct was that of unease, an unexplainable tension she couldn't shake. Families often experience these subtle feelings, brief moments of intuition that something is off. But intuition rarely hits as hard as it did for Romy that morning, when she entered the main house, expecting the usual sounds of life. Her parents moving about, the clatter of breakfast, maybe even the distant sounds of Nick working in the guest house. She was met with silence. A silence so complete, so unnatural, that it immediately set off alarms in her mind. Romy called out for her parents. There was no response. At first, she tried to rationalize it. Perhaps they were asleep, perhaps the house was just quiet. But something deep inside told her that this was not normal. She started moving through the home, each step accompanied by a growing sense of dread. Then, in one of the main rooms, she saw them, Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, lying motionless. The sight was incomprehensible. In an instant, the people she had known and loved all her life were gone, and the reality of the situation slammed into her with unrelenting force. The scene was chaotic, not in the sense of overturned furniture or struggle, but in the emotional shock it inflicted. The house, which had always been a sanctuary, now seemed alien, hostile, and suffocating. Romy's mind raced. How could this happen? Who could do something like this? And most importantly, was anyone still in danger? The questions multiplied, each one more urgent than the last, and yet no answers presented themselves immediately. As Romy's voice trembled, she called the authorities. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. When the police arrived, they were met with a scene that defied expectation. The bodies of Rob and Michelle showed signs of brutal violence, multiple stab wounds indicating a frenzied, intentional attack. It was clear to investigators that this was not a random act, not a robbery gone wrong, and certainly not a simple domestic accident. The level of violence suggested deep anger, premeditation, and a personal connection to the victims. And as they combed the house for evidence, every corner seemed to hold another piece of the puzzle, each piece more disturbing than the last. From the outset, suspicion fell on Nick Reiner. The authorities were aware that he lived on the property, albeit in a separate guest house. His proximity to the scene and the reports of a dangerous family member made him an immediate person of interest. Investigators began compiling statements, reviewing security footage, and reconstructing timelines. But even with these standard procedures, the horror of the crime was so visceral that every detective on the scene felt the weight of it. This wasn't just a murder investigation. It was the unraveling of a family, the exposure of secrets, and the start of a story that would shock the entire nation. One of the most haunting aspects of that morning was Romy's dual role as witness and survivor. Not only did she discover her parents, but she also had to contend with the terrifying knowledge that a family member, someone she had known all her life, might have been responsible. The emotional strain was nearly unbearable. She was terrified, heartbroken, and confused, all at once. And while law enforcement focused on gathering physical evidence, Romy faced the deeper, more painful task of grappling with the betrayal and horror unfolding before her eyes. As investigators began their work, they noticed small but significant details that hinted at the complexity of the situation. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, ruling out robbery. The precision of the attack suggested someone familiar with the household's routines and layout. The emotional impact of the murders was compounded by the realization that the Reiner family's public image of perfection had concealed tensions, frustrations, and perhaps even threats that had gone unnoticed or unheeded for years. The media quickly picked up the story, and within hours, the narrative had spread beyond Los Angeles. Headlines screamed of the brutal murders, the arrest of the son, and the unimaginable discovery that was yet to be revealed. Social media exploded with speculation, shock, and horror. People couldn't reconcile the image of the affluent, polished Reiners with the violence and fear that had erupted in their home. The story was consuming the nation, and yet the most disturbing revelations were still to come. Amid the chaos, police were called to inspect every inch of the property. Rooms were examined, fingerprints collected, and timelines reconstructed. It was during this meticulous process that investigators would uncover something even more shocking than the murders themselves, a secret that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Behind the walls of the mansion, concealed from anyone outside the family, was a space that defied imagination. A space that held a 12-year-old girl, chained and trapped, her life unfolding in complete secrecy. The discovery of the girl behind Rob Reiner's bedroom wall was a turning point in the investigation. It transformed the story from a shocking double murder into a narrative of unimaginable horror and human cruelty. How could a child be hidden in a home of such size and prominence? What horrors had she endured, and for how long? And how did the very structure of the mansion, designed for luxury and comfort, become a cage for a human life? The juxtaposition of these events, the violent deaths of Rob and Michelle, the apparent normalcy of the household, and the hidden captivity of a child, creates a tension that is almost impossible to comprehend. The Sunday morning that began like any other had turned into a nightmare. The tranquil streets of Brentwood bore silent witness to a horror that no one could have foreseen. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they had to contend not only with physical evidence, but also with the emotional complexity of a family in crisis. Romy's statements became crucial, her insights into family dynamics, past conflicts, and warning signs guiding the investigation in directions that were both enlightening and horrifying. And as the story continued to unfold, it became clear that the Reiner estate, with all its grandeur and elegance, had been a stage for both love and terror, concealment and betrayal. The Sunday morning horror was only the beginning. What Romy had discovered, the deaths, the immediate suspicions, the hidden danger, was a gateway into a narrative that would reveal layers of darkness no one could have anticipated. The investigation was far from over, and the discoveries that awaited law enforcement would shock even the most seasoned detectives. And yet, the most terrifying moment had not yet arrived. Behind that bedroom wall, the true extent of the horror waited. The 12-year-old girl, chained and hidden, was about to become the focal point of a story that would challenge assumptions, expose secrets, and leave the entire nation in disbelief. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. When a family tragedy occurs, the immediate impulse is often to search for answers. In the Reiner case, those answers pointed sharply and almost immediately toward one person, Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son who lived in the guest house on the sprawling Brentwood estate. He had grown up in the shadow of wealth and privilege, a son in a family that appeared perfect on the surface. But appearances, as this story makes painfully clear, can be deceiving. Within hours of the discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies, Nick had been identified as the primary suspect, and the questions surrounding him were as numerous as they were unsettling. Nick was not a stranger to the police. While there were no prior violent offenses, investigators noted patterns in his behavior that suggested volatility and a potential for danger when pushed. Neighbors described him as quiet, withdrawn, and sometimes irritable. personality traits that might seem harmless in isolation but became critically relevant when placed within the context of the family's private dynamics. He was also the son who had lived in a separate guest house, physically close to the main house, yet somewhat removed, a position that would later prove significant in understanding the timeline of the murders and the concealment of the family's secrets. Authorities began by compiling a detailed profile. Nick's background, social interactions, and relationships with his parents were scrutinized. Investigators examined financial records, phone logs, and social media activity, searching for motives, triggers, or any indication of premeditation. One detail quickly emerged. The relationship between Nick and his parents had been fraught for years. Though outwardly polite, their interactions were often tense, punctuated by disagreements and undercurrents of resentment. These dynamics would later become critical in understanding the events of that tragic Sunday morning. Family insiders revealed that Nick had experienced a sense of isolation within the household. While the family projected an image of cohesion and unity, Nick had often been described as difficult or troubled, traits that were perhaps amplified by the pressures of living in such a high-profile environment. The constant scrutiny, the unspoken expectations, and the weight of a family name created tensions that few could navigate. Whether these tensions directly influenced his alleged actions is a question that investigators would continue to explore, but they established an emotional context that made the tragedy more comprehensible, if no less shocking. Law enforcement quickly focused on motive. Was this act of violence spontaneous, or had it been planned? Were there financial incentives at play, or were the murders the result of long-simmering familial conflict? Theories abounded. One line of inquiry centered on inheritance and control of the estate, a sprawling property worth millions, complete with multiple residences and assets. Another explored the possibility of mental health struggles, which might have contributed to irrational behavior or emotional volatility. The combination of proximity, family tension, and potential motive made Nick an immediate suspect in the eyes of the law. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered inconsistencies in Nick's accounts of his whereabouts and activities. Every detail was scrutinized: the timing of his movements, his interactions with household staff, and any unusual behavior observed by neighbors or family friends. Forensic analysis, including fingerprints, footprints, and surveillance footage, was meticulously collected. Every piece of evidence would be weighed against witness statements and physical findings in the home. While the initial focus was on Nick, law enforcement remained careful, aware that assumptions could lead to errors. But the weight of circumstantial evidence, combined with Romy's tip about a dangerous family member, painted a picture that investigators could not ignore. The media quickly amplified the narrative. Headlines proclaimed the shocking betrayal of a son against his parents, fueling public fascination and horror. Social media commentary oscillated between disbelief, anger, and speculation. Questions raced through the minds of the public. How could a son commit such an act? Was there more to the story than met the eye? And how could a family that seemed so perfect fall apart in such a violent, irreversible way? The scrutiny placed on Nick was intense, with journalists, commentators, and online audiences dissecting every detail of his life and character. While public attention focused on Nick, law enforcement's approach remained methodical. Officers interviewed family members, friends, and neighbors, building a timeline of the days and hours leading up to the murders. Investigators sought to understand not only the crime itself, but the underlying familial relationships that might have contributed to the tragedy. Nick's own statements were analyzed for consistency, emotion, and potential deception. Every pause, every contradiction, every hesitation became a critical point of inquiry. It was during this phase that investigators began to uncover the first hints of the hidden horror within the estate. While the murders themselves were shocking, the property contained spaces and secrets that had previously gone unnoticed, including the bedroom wall behind which a 12-year-old girl was hidden. This revelation transformed the investigation from a murder case into a broader inquiry into captivity, neglect, and abuse. Suddenly, Nick's potential role expanded beyond the immediate violence of the murders to include questions about the child's concealment. The psychological dimension of Nick's behavior became a central focus. Experts were brought in to analyze his personality, tendencies, and possible mental health concerns. Patterns of isolation, aggression, and detachment were evaluated in the context of the family dynamics and the extreme circumstances of the Reiner estate. Each new piece of information contributed to a growing profile that helped law enforcement anticipate potential risks, understand motivations, and reconstruct the night of the murders with greater clarity. And yet, even with all the evidence collected, questions remained. What had driven Nick to allegedly commit such acts? How had the girl remained hidden for so long? Why had Romy perceived a danger that others overlooked? These uncertainties created a narrative tension that would carry the investigation forward, maintaining a sense of urgency, dread, and suspense. The story of Nick Reiner is not just the story of a suspect. It is a story about the complex interplay of family dynamics, wealth, secrecy, and human psychology. It illustrates how appearances can be deceiving, how proximity can be both a privilege and a curse, and how a single individual's actions can reverberate through an entire family and beyond. As law enforcement prepared to question Nick in detail, they knew that the answers he provided, or failed to provide, could unlock the next stage of this shocking investigation. Every response, every reaction, every piece of information would be analyzed and cross-referenced with the physical evidence, the testimonies, and the hidden realities within the mansion. The tension was palpable, not just for investigators, but for the public following the unfolding story. But even as attention focused on Nick, the true horror of the estate remained obscured. The girl behind the wall, the secret that had gone unnoticed for years, was the next revelation that would turn a tragic murder case into a story that would leave the nation stunned. Nick Reiner's alleged actions were horrific, but the discovery that awaited investigators would be even more unimaginable. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. In every great tragedy, there is often a moment where ordinary surroundings reveal themselves to be anything but ordinary. In the case of the Reiner estate, that moment came in the form of a bedroom wall, a seemingly innocuous structure within the main house that concealed a secret so horrifying it would redefine the entire narrative of the family's tragedy. What appeared to be a simple, decorative wall, part of the mansion's elegant design, was in reality a barrier between the world and a hidden horror. The discovery behind it would leave investigators, journalists, and the public alike in a state of shock. The investigation into the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner had already been intense. Law enforcement was meticulously combing the estate for evidence, analyzing every room, every surface, every detail. And yet, it was one particular bedroom that drew attention, not for signs of struggle or disturbance, but for an inexplicable anomaly that a trained officer could not ignore. Something about the wall seemed off. Perhaps it was a slight variation in texture, a faint outline suggesting a hidden space, or an uncharacteristic cold draft that seemed to emanate from behind the solid surface. Whatever it was, the seasoned detectives on the scene instinctively knew that this wall warranted closer scrutiny. The process of investigation was slow and deliberate. Officers had to balance the urgency of uncovering evidence with the caution required to avoid destroying potential clues. Tools were brought in to measure, probe, and test the wall, and as they worked, a sense of anticipation and dread grew. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and comfort, began to feel claustrophobic, almost alive with the secrets it had been guarding. Each tap, each measurement, each subtle sound amplified the tension in the room. Even seasoned investigators found themselves whispering to one another, as if speaking too loudly might awaken whatever lay hidden. When the breakthrough finally came, it was both sudden and horrifying. Behind a section of the wall that had been meticulously integrated into the room's design, officers discovered an access point. It was a small, concealed door, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. The air that escaped from the opening carried with it a scent of confinement, stale, musty, and unmistakably human. What lay beyond that door was not merely another room, but a chamber that had been used to contain a living person. The implications of this discovery sent a ripple of shock through the investigation team. Inside the hidden space, officers found the 12-year-old girl who would become one of the most central figures in this tragedy. She was chained, confined, and terrified, her entire existence until that moment defined by isolation and captivity. The sight was almost unbearable. A child who had been hidden away, living in conditions that no human should endure, within a house that had outwardly projected perfection and security. The emotional impact on everyone present was immediate and profound. There was grief, anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of horror at the cruelty that had gone unnoticed for so long. The architectural design of the mansion now took on a sinister dimension. What had once been seen as elegance and sophistication was reinterpreted as a tool for concealment. Each panel, each corner, each decorative feature became suspect. Investigators realized that the wall had not been an accidental hiding place. It had been deliberately constructed to conceal this chamber. The implications for the family dynamic were staggering. This was not merely a matter of neglect or oversight. This was a premeditated act of imprisonment, a dark secret maintained within the heart of the Reiner estate. The discovery forced law enforcement to reassess the entire case. The murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner were horrifying in themselves, but they were now part of a larger pattern of abuse and secrecy. Investigators had to consider whether the murders were directly connected to the girl's captivity. Was the concealment of the child a motive, a warning, or an unrelated atrocity? The answers were not immediately clear, but the stakes had suddenly become immeasurably higher. This was no longer just a homicide investigation. It was an inquiry into the depths of human cruelty, the boundaries of family dysfunction, and the ways in which appearances can deceive. News of the discovery, when it inevitably reached the public, would shock the nation. The image of a child chained behind a bedroom wall in a multimillion-dollar mansion seemed almost unreal. How could this have gone unnoticed for so long? How had the very structure of the home been manipulated to enable such cruelty? And perhaps most chilling of all, how had the people closest to the girl, the family, the household staff, the neighbors, failed to detect or intervene in her suffering? These questions would dominate media coverage, social commentary, and public discourse for months to come. Within the walls of the Reiner estate, the emotional and psychological toll of the discovery was profound. For investigators, it was a stark reminder of the stakes inherent in their work, the lives that could be hidden in plain sight, the horrors that could exist just beyond perception. For Romy, who had already witnessed the deaths of her parents, the revelation of the girl's captivity added another layer of trauma, a new dimension of horror to a day that had already been defined by grief and shock. And for the public, the story became a cautionary tale about the limits of observation, the dangers of assumption, and the hidden realities that can exist even in the most privileged environments. As authorities began to document and analyze the hidden room, they also focused on the immediate care and protection of the girl. Child services were called, medical evaluations were conducted, and psychological support was provided. Every detail was recorded, both to aid in the investigation and to ensure the girl's safety going forward. Her story, once fully uncovered, would reveal the extent of her confinement, the conditions she endured, and the resilience she demonstrated despite unimaginable suffering. The wall, then, became a symbol, not just of concealment, but of the broader deception that had permeated the Reiner household. It represented the contrast between appearance and reality, the way in which even the most seemingly secure environments can harbor unspeakable horrors. And as investigators prepared to uncover the full truth, the implications of what lay behind that wall would continue to unfold, revealing a web of secrecy, betrayal, and unimaginable cruelty. But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. Behind the wall, beyond the initial shock of the girl's captivity, investigators would soon uncover connections, motives, and consequences that no one, including the family itself, had anticipated. The wall had hidden not only a child, but a story that would change the understanding of the Reiner tragedy forever. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When law enforcement first pulled open the hidden panel behind Rob Reiner's bedroom wall, what they found was almost beyond comprehension. There, in a confined, dimly lit space, was a 12-year-old girl, chained and terrified. The air in the chamber was stale, heavy with the scent of confinement, and every inch of the small room bore the marks of long-term neglect. For the investigators, the scene was one of immediate alarm. But for the child, it was the only life she had ever known within that hidden prison. The girl's eyes reflected a mixture of fear, confusion, and profound mistrust. She had likely been hidden away for years, her perception of the world defined by the narrow confines of the wall-enclosed room. What life had she lived? What horrors had she endured? These were the first questions that flashed through the minds of the police officers on the scene. While the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner were themselves horrific, this discovery introduced a new, unimaginable dimension to the story: the deliberate imprisonment of a child within a family estate, hidden in plain sight. Immediate action was taken. Medical professionals were called to evaluate the girl's physical condition. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and physically weakened, a clear sign that her captivity had taken a serious toll on her health. Investigators also noted signs of prolonged restraint: marks on her wrists and ankles, abrasions from chains, and the psychological signs of fear, anxiety, and shock. The trauma she had endured was both physical and emotional, and addressing it required delicacy and care. The authorities understood that the first step in uncovering the full story would be to establish trust with the child, allowing her to speak about the horrors she had experienced in a way that could be documented and acted upon. As the girl was gently removed from the chamber, investigators faced the chilling reality of the lengths to which secrecy had been maintained in the Reiner household. This was not an accidental concealment or an improvised hiding place. The construction of the chamber had been intentional, designed to keep the child completely isolated from anyone outside the family. The sophistication of the concealment, built into the mansion's architecture, unnoticed for years, underscored the calculated nature of the crime. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that the child remained hidden, a silent witness to the darkest recesses of the family's secrets. The child's psychological state was immediately assessed by trained therapists. Her responses were cautious, tentative, reflecting both fear and a deeply ingrained sense of caution. Having spent formative years in isolation, she had learned to be wary, to remain quiet, and to navigate a world in which adults could not be trusted. The revelation that this girl had been living in such conditions in one of Los Angeles's wealthiest neighborhoods sparked nationwide shock. Questions flooded the media and the public alike. How could this happen? How had no one noticed her absence? And what role did the family play in orchestrating this nightmare? Law enforcement began piecing together what little information they could from the girl's testimony. Her recounting of events was fragmented, often interrupted by fear and anxiety, yet it began to form a disturbing pattern. The child had been aware of her isolation from the very beginning. She had been forbidden from speaking about the outside world, confined in a space where light was minimal and contact with other humans limited. The psychological toll was profound. The development of trust, social skills, and a sense of safety had been stunted by years of deliberate confinement. The discovery also raised questions about complicity, both within and outside the household. Staff, neighbors, and other family members were questioned extensively. Investigators wanted to understand whether the child's concealment had been witnessed, suspected, or ignored. The answers suggested that this hidden life had been maintained primarily through careful secrecy and manipulation, leaving almost no trace for outsiders to detect. It was a chilling reminder of how appearances could be manipulated to conceal horrors in plain sight. As the girl began to interact with her rescuers, small details emerged that hinted at the severity of her experience. She had learned to survive in isolation, to ration food, and to avoid detection. Her world was small, controlled, and utterly dominated by fear. Every interaction with adults, every movement outside the hidden chamber, was a negotiation with a reality she had never truly experienced. Investigators, while focused on her immediate physical safety, also recognized the immense task of helping her reclaim a sense of normalcy and trust. The child's story also added complexity to the investigation of the murders. How much did her concealment influence the events that led to the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner? Was the violence connected to her captivity, or was it an entirely separate atrocity? Law enforcement had to consider multiple scenarios, examining timelines, behavioral patterns, and the intricate web of relationships within the household. The girl's presence added a layer of urgency, moral gravity, and emotional weight that transformed the case into more than just a homicide investigation. It became a study of human cruelty, manipulation, and the capacity for hidden evil. Media coverage quickly picked up the story, amplifying the national fascination and horror. Public response was a mixture of outrage, disbelief, and intense curiosity. Headlines highlighted the unimaginable nature of the crime. A child imprisoned behind a bedroom wall in one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods. The narrative was difficult to digest, and for many, it challenged the very assumptions we make about privilege, safety, and family life. How could such a secret go unnoticed for so long? What psychological forces allowed a child to be hidden in plain sight? And what role did complicity, fear, or neglect play in maintaining that secrecy? Within the Reiner estate, the discovery of the girl in chains forced a reassessment of the family dynamic. Nick Reiner, already the prime suspect in his parents' murders, now faced additional scrutiny. Was he involved in her captivity? Did other family members play a role? How long had the child been confined? And what had been the circumstances that allowed such cruelty to continue unchecked? These questions guided the next phase of the investigation, leading to interviews, forensic analysis, and the meticulous documentation of every detail surrounding the hidden chamber. For the girl, the world outside the wall was both terrifying and liberating. The initial moments of freedom were fraught with fear, confusion, and disorientation. She had never experienced the sensation of space, sunlight, or unrestrained movement. For investigators and caregivers, each step had to be carefully managed, balancing the need for information with her immediate psychological well-being. The complexity of her situation underscored the depth of the family's secrecy and the sheer audacity of the crimes that had taken place within the estate. And yet, even as the girl began to adjust to her newfound freedom, the investigation revealed that her story was only the beginning. Behind the initial shock of her captivity lay layers of hidden behavior, calculated concealment, and potential complicity that would soon redefine the Reiner family tragedy. The child's survival was remarkable, but it also illuminated the depths of planning, control, and cruelty that had allowed her life to be confined in such horrific conditions. The story of the girl in chains is both heartbreaking and critical to understanding the full scope of the Reiner tragedy. It reveals how a life can be hidden in plain sight, how appearances can deceive, and how courage, both in coming forward and surviving, can illuminate truths that might otherwise remain forever obscured. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. In the aftermath of the discovery of the girl behind Rob Reiner's bedroom wall, investigators faced a sobering reality. The evidence of what had transpired in the Reiner estate was all around them, yet much of it had gone unnoticed for years. Often, the most damning clues in a case are not hidden in obscure places, but are instead overlooked because they blend seamlessly into everyday life. The Reiner household, with its polished floors, elegant decor, and air of normalcy, had been full of these subtle signals that, if read correctly, might have revealed the horrifying truth much sooner. The first clues were almost mundane. Investigators noticed slight inconsistencies in the layout of the mansion, panels that seemed unusually thick, corners that didn't match the architectural plans, and faint, almost imperceptible marks on walls where maintenance had been oddly infrequent. At first glance, these details appeared to be ordinary features of an expensive, custom-built home. But upon closer inspection, they suggested something more deliberate. A structure that had been modified to conceal something or someone from view. Staff members, who had worked in the Reiner household for years, were interviewed extensively. Many expressed surprise at the revelation, claiming they had never noticed anything unusual. Yet subtle patterns began to emerge. Cleaning schedules that had avoided certain rooms, explanations for missing items that now seemed improbable, and hushed conversations that were dismissed as family disputes. Each of these small details, when pieced together, created a map of concealment and secrecy. The investigators began to realize that the signs had always been there. They just required the right context to be understood. Neighbors, too, provided critical insights. While the Reiners had cultivated an image of affability and openness, some neighbors recalled moments of odd behavior. There were the brief glimpses of someone being led quickly indoors, the occasional unexplained comings and goings at odd hours, and subtle hints of tension in the family's interactions with visitors. None of these observations were dramatic on their own, but together they formed a pattern of secrecy and control that pointed to deeper issues within the household. Even within the family itself, there were clues that went unheeded. Romy, for example, had long felt a sense of unease about certain dynamics in the home. She had observed behaviors, small, seemingly insignificant, that suggested tension and potential danger. Over the years, these instincts were dismissed, rationalized, or ignored. Yet in hindsight, they were prescient indicators of the darkness lurking beneath the Reiners' polished exterior. Romy's courage in coming forward ultimately bridged the gap between intuition and revelation, allowing law enforcement to act on what others had overlooked. Physical evidence within the mansion also told a story. Dust patterns, scuffed floors, and unusual wear on certain surfaces suggested movement and activity in areas that were otherwise hidden. Investigators noted inconsistencies in furniture placement, structural modifications that seemed unnecessary for aesthetic purposes, and objects that had been deliberately obscured. These were clues not of spontaneous concealment, but of planning, a calculated effort to hide a person and perhaps other evidence within the home. Even the family's routine contributed to the concealment. The Reiners' lifestyle, characterized by wealth, privilege, and relative isolation, created an environment where oversight was minimal. The distance between the main house and the guest house, the selective interactions with staff, and the careful management of social appearances all played a role in keeping the child's captivity hidden. The very structure of privilege, designed to protect and elevate the family, inadvertently enabled the concealment of a horrifying secret. Forensic analysis reinforced the reality of the clues. Fingerprints, DNA traces, and other physical evidence provided tangible connections between the hidden chamber, the child, and the broader household. These findings were cross-referenced with testimonies, timelines, and observations from staff and neighbors. Each piece of the puzzle, while minor in isolation, collectively painted a picture of deliberate concealment and abuse. Media coverage of the clues hidden in plain sight fascinated the public. Audiences were both horrified and intrigued by the realization that the signs of the girl's captivity had existed all along, visible to anyone who knew where to look, but easily dismissed by those who didn't. It sparked broader discussions about human perception, the assumptions we make based on appearances, and the ways in which trauma and abuse can be masked by wealth and social status. The implications of these overlooked clues extended beyond the immediate investigation. They forced investigators to question everything previously assumed about the household, the family, and the events leading up to the murders. Could earlier detection have prevented the tragedy? Were there warning signs that, if recognized, might have saved lives or exposed the hidden abuse sooner? These questions became central to the ongoing investigation and to the public discourse surrounding the Reiner case. Ultimately, the clues hidden in plain sight underscored a chilling truth. The most devastating secrets are often those that hide in familiarity, in normalcy, and in plain view. The Reiner estate, with all its luxury and elegance, had provided the perfect cover for crimes that were as calculated as they were cruel. Every overlooked mark, every dismissed intuition, every unexamined irregularity became a testament to the difficulty of seeing the truth when it is carefully concealed behind layers of perception and privilege. And as investigators prepared to delve even deeper, it became clear that the story was far from over. The murder of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the captivity of the girl, and the clues hidden within the mansion were only the beginning. The next revelations would expose the full extent of planning, control, and deception that had defined the Reiner household, and would challenge everything previously assumed about who could be trusted and what horrors could remain unseen. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. With the discovery of the girl behind Rob Reiner's bedroom wall and the mounting evidence pointing toward Nick Reiner, law enforcement knew the investigation had entered a critical phase. The initial shock and chaos of the murders had given way to meticulous, relentless detective work. Every detail mattered, every movement was analyzed, and every piece of evidence was scrutinized for connections that could explain not only the killings but the hidden captivity that had gone unnoticed for so long. The stakes had never been higher, and the eyes of the nation were now fixed squarely on the Reiner estate. Investigators began by isolating the family members for questioning. Romy, who had discovered the bodies of her parents, provided crucial testimony, detailing her observations of Nick's behavior, past conflicts within the family, and suspicions she had long harbored. Her statements created a foundation upon which the police could build, offering insight into the family dynamics that might have contributed to the murders. Every nuance mattered: the tone of voice, the hesitation in responses, and the contradictions in memories. All of it could help uncover the truth. Nick, already under intense scrutiny, became the focal point of the investigation. Law enforcement was particularly concerned with establishing a timeline of his activities on the day of the murders. Where had he been? What had he done? And, perhaps most critically, how did the girl end up behind the wall? Officers reviewed security footage from the estate and nearby streets, interviewed staff who had minimal contact with him, and even examined digital footprints, texts, emails, and social media activity to understand his movements and intentions. Each detail, no matter how small, was a potential key to unlocking the mystery of that day. The mansion itself became a subject of forensic analysis. Every room, hallway, and hidden nook was combed for clues. Dust patterns, fingerprints, and traces of movement were cataloged and analyzed. Investigators paid close attention to the architecture and design of the estate, recognizing that its luxurious construction had inadvertently, or perhaps deliberately, facilitated concealment. Even decorative features were examined for signs of modification, revealing the meticulous effort required to hide a child behind a bedroom wall. The house, once a symbol of wealth and comfort, was now a central piece of evidence, revealing layers of planning and deception that would have gone unnoticed by any casual observer. Interviews with neighbors added another layer of context. Witnesses reported seeing Nick at odd hours, sometimes moving quickly between the main house and the guest house. While none of these observations directly implicated him in the murders, they provided important details for constructing a timeline. Investigators also collected anecdotal evidence about family interactions, social patterns, and past conflicts that could indicate motive or behavioral tendencies. Each fragment of information was cross-referenced with physical evidence, slowly forming a cohesive picture of what might have transpired. Financial records were another area of intense scrutiny. Investigators examined bank statements, transactions, and inheritance arrangements to determine whether money or assets could have played a role in the murders. While there was no immediate evidence of financial disputes as the primary motive, the analysis revealed patterns of control, access, and dependency that illuminated tensions within the family. These details, while subtle, were critical to understanding the broader context in which the crimes occurred. The girl's testimony, carefully collected by trained psychologists and child services personnel, also played a pivotal role. Her fragmented recollections, while initially incomplete, began to reveal a pattern of manipulation and concealment. She described periods of isolation, limited contact with family members, and the psychological impact of being hidden away. Her statements were treated with utmost sensitivity, but they provided crucial insights into the household's dynamics, the potential involvement of Nick, and the lengths to which secrecy had been maintained. As the investigation tightened, law enforcement also considered potential accomplices or enablers. Could anyone else have facilitated the girl's confinement? Were there staff members, friends, or extended family who were aware, at least in part, of what had been happening? These questions prompted a broader examination of the household's social environment, revealing both the vulnerabilities and the deliberate silences that had allowed the abuse to continue. The media, following every development, amplified the tension. News outlets reported on the girl's captivity, the suspicion surrounding Nick, and the meticulous nature of the investigation. Public fascination reached unprecedented levels, with audiences captivated by the combination of wealth, family betrayal, and hidden horror. Every detail released, carefully vetted by law enforcement, only heightened the national sense of shock and anticipation. The story had transformed from a tragic murder case into a complex psychological and forensic puzzle, one whose pieces were slowly being brought together. Psychologists and criminal profilers were consulted to better understand Nick's potential motivations and behaviors. They examined the family history, personality traits, and patterns of past behavior to anticipate possible actions and reactions. This type of profiling, while not definitive, provided law enforcement with valuable context for questioning and interpreting evidence. The insights gleaned from these experts would become critical in predicting how Nick might respond under interrogation and in evaluating the credibility of conflicting accounts. The pressure on investigators was immense. They were not only uncovering the truth about a brutal double murder, but also confronting the shocking reality of a child's long-term captivity. Every decision had to balance the urgency of justice with the need for precision. Missteps could compromise the case, endanger the child, or allow a potential killer to escape accountability. The complexity of the investigation, combined with the public attention and emotional intensity, created an atmosphere of relentless scrutiny and tension.